In this section, we're going to figure out how to render a list of components. Previously, we had made a single thumbnail, but it makes sense that we probably want to have more than one thumbnail on our page. The first question we need to ask of ourselves about making a list of thumbnails is, well, what exactly are we rendering multiples of? The thumbnail, of course, right? Well, the thumbnail itself shouldn't really know how to make a list out of itself. We always want to make our components as small and composable as possible. So a thumbnail should only really know how to render a single discrete thumbnail. So instead, we're going to make a third component called thumbnail list. Thumbnail list is going to know how to make a list of thumbnails. We're going to pass in an options object that will tell it how to make these multiple thumbnails. So let's get started. We're going to start by copying our project directory, and we're going to rename it to thumbnail list. I'm going to open up our index.html, and then I'm going to open up our code editor. We have our thumbnail list open. Great. So let's get started by scaffolding out our thumbnail list. I'm going to say var thumbnail list, and we'll create a new React class and pass it a configuration object. The only method that we're going to add in here for right now is our render function. Great. The next thing we're going to do is update our create element. We're no longer creating an instance of thumbnail. We're making an instance of thumbnail list. So we'll just add on list, and now we're going to render a thumbnail list. Next thing we got to concern ourselves about is our options object. We're currently passing in options that will render a single thumbnail. Now we need to figure out a way to pass in enough data to make multiple thumbnails. And the way we're going to do this is instead of passing in a single object, we're going to pass in multiple objects. So we're going to wrap this object in an array. And then on the outside of that, we're going to make our lives a little bit easier. You're going to have to bear with me for just a second here by adding another object. The key to the array of objects will be thumbnail data, and that's going to point at the array of objects. So at this point, if we kind of remove this interior, all this data inside, we would have an options object, and this is just for example, that looks like this. We have a outside object that has a key thumbnail data that points at an array of object. And then each of these objects in here will have data on how to make a single instance of a thumbnail. So now that we've got our options object formed up a little better here, we need data for a second thumbnail. So to do so, I'm going to take our first instance of our options for the first thumbnail. I'm going to copy it. And then we're going to, since this is an array, I'm going to add a comma and then just paste. So now I should have an array with two objects in it. Now we need some data in here that's going to represent our second thumbnail. So we're just going to change a couple variables in here, a couple properties, excuse me. And instead of number being 12, we'll say 25. For the header, we're going to learn about something that's going to be in an upcoming section, which is gulp. For the description, we'll do a similar little blurb about gulp, and we'll say gulp will speed up your development workflow. And again, we're just going to save ourselves a little bit of time and just copy paste that over to get some filler text in there. Lastly, we need an image for the gulp logo. So let's hop over to Google, make a new tab, and we'll search for gulp space JS. Go to images, and this looks fantastic right here. I'll select it, view the image, and then we're going to take the URL at the top and replace the existing one. Okay, So now we have options for 2 separate thumbnails. Just to be clear, again, the overall structure of this object is an options that we're going to pass in this options object into the create element. This options object will have a single key, which is thumbnail data. That's going to point to an array of objects. And then each interior object describes what an individual instance of thumbnail is going to look like. Now let's go back to thumbnail list render method up here. We're going to make use of a native JavaScript function called map to turn these objects into components. We always use map on an array, and when you map an array, you call a function on every element in the array. The return value of this function gets added to a new array, and when that loop is complete, that new array gets returned. So that's a lot to digest. Let's do a practical example. We will return, actually first we'll do a list. So we'll say var list equals this.props. And again, think about how this options object is going to show up inside of this component. This object right here is exactly what props is. So to get our list of options in here, our list of individual thumbnail data options, we'll say this.props.thumbnail data. So right here, this reference right here will be pointing at this array. So we're going to map this array. And again, we're going to pass it a function. This function is going to get called on each of these objects. And the first argument to that function will be the object itself. So we'll call it thumbnail props. So you can kind of imagine that at this point in time, thumbnail props is going to first be this object. Whatever gets returned from this array will be the first element of list. It will then call this function on the second element, which will be this object. And this object will show up in this function as thumbnail props. And then whatever we return from the function will show up as the second element of list. So now that we're inside of here, we can really make our actual component, which is going to be thumbnail. We can make multiple instances of thumbnail. So I'm going to return not an li, just thumbnail. And we need to pass in some number or these actual properties into there. And the way, in this case, we have the entire object right here. And you might think, well, great, we can write out title equals thumbnail props.title and number equals blah, 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 and so on and so on. Well, React has a little shortcut here for whenever you want to pass in an entire object and not really worry about picking off individual options. And to do that, we're just going to do curly braces and then ... thumbnail props. And what this says is take this entire options object right here and create an instance of thumbnail passing in all of those properties in there. Okay, so now we should have a list, and list is going to be an array of thumbnail instances. Now all we have to do is render this onto the page. So we're going to return a div, and inside of that div is going to be our list. So let's save, come over to our index.html. We're going to open our console just in case anything went wrong, and refresh. Fantastic. We can see that we have 2 instances of thumbnail in here, and they're both being rendered by thumbnail list. Each instance has its own set of properties that match up perfectly with each object that we passed in. So you can see the first instance, of course, got Learn React, numbered 12 on the badge. Title is Show Courses, and similar for the second thumbnail right here. All right, fantastic. Now we know how to make a list. If this seems a little bit unclear, don't sweat it. Lists are something that we're going to do very frequently, so we're going to be coming back to the idea of rendering lists quite a bit. Catch you in the next section.